After nearly 2 decades dominating the pop culture discourse, ranking every MCU phase from worst to best is no easy task. As a brand, the MCU is responsible for catalyzing the modern movie industry's obsession with superheroes, catapulting them from niche interest to mainstream success. Whether in advocacy or opposition, it's impossible to not have an opinion on the MCU. The MCU story begins back in 2008 with the release of Jon Favreau's much-celebrated Iron Man. After taking a punt on then-controversial leading man Robert Downey Jr., the movie went above and beyond many introductory episodes, hinting at a wider saga beyond the central story and innovating the signature MCU post-credit scene. The rest of Phase 1 introduced the likes of Thor and Captain America, culminating in the epic Avengers crossover event. As Phases 2 and 3 developed, Marvel expanded its character roster and scope, branching into outer space and introducing one of cinema's most iconic antagonists in the form of Thanos. With the first 3 phases dubbed the Infinity Saga, Phase 4 has been even more ambitious, exploring the boundaries of the multiverse itself. Needless to say, the MCU scope hasn't been tempered with age. As is to be expected with such a well-established property, each MCU phase has had both high and low points. For every Captain America, the Winter Soldier, there's a Thor, the Dark World waiting to ruin the average. As such, declaring any definitive ranking is near impossible, since so much comes down to individual taste. Nevertheless, after 15 years at the top, it is possible to draw some conclusions about the collective MCU project as a whole. Here is every MCU phase ranked, from worst to best. 4. Phase 1. It might seem sacrilegious to place the phase that started it all at the bottom of the pile, but there are several reasons why the MCU Phase 1 falls short. Although Iron Man and the Avengers, in particular, were monumental filmmaking achievements, the latter one of the most iconic and successful team-up movies of all time, it's impossible to ignore some of Phase 1's weaker elements. This is particularly significant given the relative dearth of content compared to other later phases. Given that Phase 1 includes only 6 movies, the effects of any misstep are keenly felt. Although The Incredible Hulk, Thor and Captain America all have their strengths and introduced iconic characters to the franchise, they are all flawed projects. The lukewarm reception to Edward Norton's take on Bruce Banner, for instance, required a complete reset ahead of the Avengers, while Thor arguably didn't find his feet until Taika Waititi took the helm and redefined the character. Revisiting the films in 2022, there is also an uncomfortable leery quality to Favreau's Iron Man movies which, coupled with Iron Man 2's confusing narrative and mediocre villain, perhaps makes both films less successful in hindsight. There's no doubt that the MCU Phase 1 is an impressive storytelling achievement. However, compared to its peers, some aspects slightly disappoint. 3. Phase 4. There can be no faulting the MCU Phase 4's ambition. Following one of the most epic conclusions in cinematic history was always going to be hard, yet Phase 4 has pushed boundaries and expectations, introducing myriad narrative, thematic and tonal elements to make the MCU more dynamic and varied than ever. However, for all this variety, the MCU Phase 4 currently suffers from a lack of singular focus that made Phases 1-3's central story so successful. Filling the void left by Thanos was always going to be a challenge and, as Phase 4 draws to a close, the Titan's absence is still keenly felt. Though several projects have explored the concept of the multiverse and the dangers that it poses, the threat is still nebulous and disparate. It remains difficult to define a single narrative running through Phase 4, and this lack of connectivity undermines the strength of the overall story. In this case, ambition may well be the enemy of success. This is not to say, however, that Phase 4 is an unmitigated failure, far from it. The MCU's expansion to the small screen with the likes of WandaVision, Loki, and What If has allowed creativity to run wild, giving popular characters comprehensive arcs, engaging stories and a fitting place in the wider narrative. Projects like Moon Knight and Ms. Marvel have also pushed the MCU into new territory, and have been warmly received by both critics and the fanbase, highlighting how the MCU has adapted and developed with time. Meanwhile, movies like Spider-Man, No Way Home and Shang-Chi and The Legend of the Ten Rings have proved that the MCU can still deliver incredible spectacle, coupled with heartfelt, expert storytelling. Phase the 4th of May be inconsistent, highlighted by stumbling blocks like Eternals, but this volatility arguably makes it one of the most compelling chapters in the MCU to date, even without a central driving villain to provide better shape to the narrative. 2. Phase 2. In some ways, the sheer amount of content in Phase 4 should make it hard for Phase 2 to compete. However, for all the incredible growth and development on display, there's no escaping the fact that Phase 2's central unifying story makes it a more compelling and comprehensible viewing experience. Even ignoring the burgeoning threat of Thanos and the growing role of the Infinity Stones, however, Phase 2 still ranks as one of the MCU's most interesting and surprisingly innovative chapters. After the success of the Avengers, it would have been tempting for Marvel Studios to continue to go bigger and bolder, moving away from their compelling characters. Instead, Phase 2 kicked off with Iron Man 3, a complex psychological portrait of its tortured main character and a marked tonal shift away from the Avengers. Likewise, Captain America: The Winter Soldier remains one of the most impressive spy thrillers to be released by any major studio in the 21st century, while Guardians of the Galaxy launched the MCU into space in spectacular fashion, turning some of Marvel's more niche characters into household names in the process. The different tones and genres of these projects highlighted for the first time how the superhero genre was not a creative cage, it could encompass espionage just as successfully as sci-fi, setting the foundations for what the MCU has now become. Just as in every MCU phase, Phase 2 includes some low moments. Thor: The Dark World remains a major aberration, especially considering the successful reinvention of the character later down the line. However, even elements that were initially repudiated have aged surprisingly well. Avengers: The Age of Ultron, which many viewers dismissed upon release, is actually an underrated entry in the series, while Ant-Man expertly blended the series' sly sense of humor with innovative physics-altering action set pieces. With everything in consideration, the MCU Phase 2 arguably deserves more respect than it often gets. 1. Phase 3. When factoring in all the elements at play, the huge number of characters involved, and the culmination of a story over a decade in the making, there is perhaps no better example of a cinematic sticking the landing than the MCU Phase 3. Not only does this era of the MCU blend some of the most individually successful entries in the entire franchise, such as Captain America, Civil War, Black Panther and Thor: Ragnarok, but it also concluded the wider Infinity Saga story with one of the most daring and ambitious finales ever put to screen. On the strength of these arguments alone, it's impossible to ignore Phase 3's status as number 1. Although comparing the two may be unfair, Phase 3 actually offers an important template for Phase 4 and future MCU projects. Where Phase 4 has felt discordant and lacking a central focus, Phase 3 was laser-like in its narrative, expertly weaving character development from earlier movies to create a cohesive whole. The fracturing of the Avengers in Captain America 3 informed the team's status in Avengers: Infinity War, while Thor and Peter Parker's heartbreaking losses helped them to become more than the caricatures they could have been. Underpinning it all was the terrifying tragedy of Marvel's most compelling villain to date. Thanos, for all his undoubted flaws, was an intriguing and at times even sympathetic presence, giving heart to the malice that defined his genocidal project. He was also a rare villain who could follow through on his threat, memorably eradicating half of all life, and many popular heroes, when he finally accrued all 6 stones. Before the MCU Phase 3, no one had successfully managed to bring such an extensive story to a close in such a satisfying way. Considering how many movie trilogies fall down in the final chapter, bringing together more than 20 films in a way that felt authentic to every character and the smaller stories involved is almost miraculous. In many ways, it's unsurprising that the MCU Phase 4 feels underwhelming. Following such a spectacular climax was always going to be virtually impossible. It is a testament to the success of Phase 3 that the MCU is still searching for a worthy successor 3 years after Thanos finally bit the dust. Key release dates: Black Panther, Wakanda Forever release date, the 11th of November 2022. Ant-Man the Wasp, Quantumania release date, the 17th of February 2023. Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 3 release date, the 5th of May 2023. The Marvels, Captain Marvel 2 release date, the 28th of July 2023. Captain America, New World Order release date, the 3rd of May 2024. Marvel's Thunderbolts release date, the 26th of July 2024.
My heart returns to you. Dinner, you were great. We can go back to mine if you want to. You look so good, I want to do that. I must be tripping. God, catch my breath.